Fireside 5. Today we have Dr. Iboro Umana with us, and he is going to be giving a presentation about reconciling the daily experience of being a minority doctor in a climate of continued police brutality and racial violence. I want to thank all of you guys for being here today and talking about such an important subject, something that I think we're all feeling really strongly about, as we should. So I just want to take a minute to give a little bit of background about Fireside at 5. We are a solution-driven platform. We bring diverse minds together for intentional conversation with the goal of creating change and action. So what better way to do that than with this group right here? I'm going to let Loren Deutsch from Loren Academic Services start us off with a little bit of an introduction, and then we're going to introduce all of the participants today and let Dr. Umana give his presentation. So without further ado, Loren Deutsch.
Thank you. Well, welcome. I'm really glad to be here, and I greatly appreciate it. I'm going to just be very brief so that we can jump right in, but I've known Iboro for a number of years and have had the opportunity to come to know him over a period of time through medical school and into residency, his family and so forth. And I consider it really a privilege to do the work that I do, but it really allows me an opportunity to get to meet a variety. Oh dear, organic little moment here. We're going to pause. Sorry.
We're gonna do a little bit of dog work over there. But Dr. Iboro Umana, do you want to give a little bit of background about yourself while we wait for Loren to come back? A little bit about your history and what you'll be presenting on today?
Loren, are you back? Or?
I'm back. I apologize, but go ahead and then I'll segue back in if you want.
Sure. So again, my name is Iboro Umana. I was born in Rochester, Minnesota, but grew up most of my life in Carbondale, Illinois. That's like 6 hours off Chicago. And went to college at Washington University in St. Louis, and then did my medical school and training, as well as received my PhD at University of Chicago. Now I'm a second-year internal medicine resident at the University of Pennsylvania, and hoping to go into gastroenterology fellowship starting in 2021.
Okay, did that very well and quickly, and thank you. And I apologize again. This is some of the challenges of working from home. Welcome, Robert, and welcome, Adlita. We see your square, but we don't see you yet. So anyway, what I had just started to say was that I've known Iboro over the years, and I consider what I do to really be a privilege, in that I get to work right at this intersection of place where students are going through school or residents are going through residency, and they're looking to get some assistance, either in a board exam or learning how to learn and so forth. And it's each time I sit down to meet with somebody to get started in that support, I do what I think a lot of times others do in this profession, and that's what we listen. And so I think with that, I want to just simply introduce Iboro and say it is really a privilege to get to listen to him tonight and to hear what he's going to say and to ask questions. I've prepared a few, which I'll put into the chat as we move along. And I've identified 4 of us who will read certain slides that Iboro has created. And so if there are questions from the group out there watching live stream, or if there are questions from participants here, if you could please flag the question you have and just put a little @ with your name, if it's from you or if it's to someone specific, so that we know exactly how you want that directed. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Iboro and let him take center stage, as he should.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Can everyone see that? Okay. All right. So again, I want to thank Loren for the opportunity to do this presentation. For added context, I'll talk about it in a second. I gave this presentation on this past Monday to my entire residency program. And it really sparked a lot of good conversation and also a lot of good action steps. And in talking to Loren, who's a very dear mentor of mine, she said it would be really good to talk about it in a larger context. I think a lot of people are processing what this means moving forward for our country and kind of what in our line of work and so forth. So without further ado, let's get started. Of course, we always have disclaimers, so this is mine. So I already kind of gave my background. One thing I do want to say is that through my experiences growing up and in education, I've really learned how important it is for family, how important it is, the importance of deep connections through my relationships with family and friends. And I know that there are several friends and family on the live stream, so hello. In part, this is a thank you, because this is a tribute to you and your investment that you've been placed in me all these years. These are the original facilitators from this past Monday, and I also thank them for helping me to put together this presentation, Dr. Umana and Dr. Claiborne Childs. These are the ground rules that we had on Monday, and I think they're relevant now. So if you're not speaking, please mute your computer or phone. I'm sure we've all had that Zoom call where you were the one where the phone rang. And for Loren, it was a dog. And then I think there's a chat box to ask questions, and feel free to do that, and we'll be monitoring that. I think a key thing, though, is to remember this is a judgment-free zone. The goal of this conversation, the goal of this talk, for people that are listening on the live stream, for people that are in the Zoom chat, is to build community. I will repeat, the goal of this talk is to build community and to connect. We cannot do that if we're judging each other. We cannot do that if there's a right or wrong. So instead, the goal is to really listen to one another, being open to new ideas and perspectives. And the last thing is, one thing I learned from Dr. Childs was that I really find useful in these kind of conversations. If you believe you've misspoken, take-backs are allowed. Again, what's the goal here? We're trying to build community. If you're trying to build community, if you're trying to connect, you're going to make mistakes. It's just natural in connecting, and that's okay. And so we should give ourselves that grace to be able to kind of reframe what we were trying to say, and because again, we're all working towards the same goal. Sorry. So just a little bit of background how this presentation came to be. A couple of weeks ago, seems so long ago, I was sitting kind of just reflecting on what's been going on with regards to another example of police brutality, a murder of George Floyd, but thinking also of the racial violence towards Ahmaud Arbery and thinking about Breonna Taylor. And I've become increasingly frustrated at that time, because over the prior couple of weeks, I hadn't heard anything from my colleagues, I hadn't heard anything from my administration. And I stress, like, I have a lot of trust and deep connections with my colleagues as well. So but to not hear anything was hard. I felt alone, I felt angry, and I felt like I felt invisible to some respect. So at a certain point, I kind of just decided, you know what, like, I'm just gonna say something. Like, I need this for my own, like, healing. I gotta say something here. And I told my class kind of what I was feeling. I also told Dr. Temescu and Dr. Childs also, and kind of saying we need more from the administration. And the response was actually quite remarkable. The support from my class, and then also the administration got quickly involved, and within 48 hours we were planning a presentation for our noon conference, which is a core part of our curriculum. And and it was very timely because that was the first weekend of kind of the protests and kind of the violence that was going on. So to have it at that time was really pertinent. And again, like I was saying before, the goal of this today's conversation is to provide a safe space and to provide language to process kind of what's going on, and thinking about how it intersects with our own identities. We're not just kind of professionals. We're not just, we're also, spouses, parents, children, and we should think about kind of how that affects how we're processing things. Many of us on this Zoom chat, like I think Chris, you and I are probably the same age. We both have PhDs, so we're really old. But anyway, many of us grew up in the era of Mike Brown. Many of us grew up in the era of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and yet it's 2020, and we're still dealing with the same things. It feels like it never ends. Think about that. Just take a second and think about how that affects your psyche. Again, as as the father, whether you're a husband or wife, parent, or a child, how are you processing it 6 years later, and are you insensitive to it? Is it just you kind of have a sense of hopelessness? It's important to kind of think about that. And also, one thing I don't want to also miss like the Amy Cooper situation, which honestly, as a Black man, was extremely traumatic to kind of see in real life, in real time, kind of what it's like to kind of see how things can get escalated very quickly. And then, as we move forward, we'd like to have basic definitions, because again, as we build community, it's really critical to be on the same page. Otherwise, we're at different levels and we're not able to move forward together. And then we'd like to talk about the history of racial violence in West Philadelphia, and to bring a couple poignant examples. Because again, as a doctor, as a Black doctor in Philadelphia, again, I'm not just thinking about my experience, I'm thinking about my patient's experience. And I think that it's really important to think about when a 70-year-old patient comes to the door, they're not just bringing their high blood pressure, they're bringing all of the cultural baggage, all of their experiences to that exam room. And we would be remiss not to incorporate that. Then as we move towards more of the reflective part of the conversation, there's a video that I would like us to view from Professor Mark Lamont Hill, on thinking about how we, as we watch the civil unrest escalate, trying to remind ourselves to not just focus on this incident, but ask ourselves, how did we get here? When you're seeing this much anger, there's a reason for it. And how did it get to this point? Instead of focusing your emotion on, oh, this Target that's very dear to me is damaged, or this Starbucks is really damaged, asking yourself, how can people be so angry? And what does it say in terms of how we've failed as a society to meet that group's needs? Then we'll share resonant reflections that were submitted anonymously ahead of our discussion on Monday, and then discuss how we move forward as a community, which will be a critical part of the conversation. So first, I'd like to talk about kind of these basic definitions. For many of us, we kind of roll our eyes, oh, I know what race means, I know what racism means, but I still think every conversation, it's really important to just give everyone the benefit of the doubt and make sure that we start on the same page. And I think one of the interesting things about the definition of race, again, is emphasis on the fact that it's a social construct, that it divides people based on arbitrary characteristics. And I think the interesting thing about race is to remember that this is a temporal, there's a temporal component. It changes at different times, and it suits the needs of society at different times. I think for a good example of this is in the 1920s, there was a huge wave of immigration, and it came right after World War I. And at that time, there was a lot of fear of all the immigrants that were coming to America. And in fact, people of Jewish descent were considered an inferior race to those who were of Nordic descent. And in fact, this was a view that was perpetuated by wealthy Protestant whites, and also the non-immigrant middle-class population. So when I say Nordic, I mean Sweden, Finland, Norway. Those were viewed as superior race at that time, which is kind of just really kind of a little bit weird to think about. And in fact, these views also intersected with religion. And although that's not the focus of our conversation, I think it's also important to realize how all these things connect, and all these things connect at a particular time. There's an interesting quote from a New York Times reporter in the 1920s. He wrote of his visit to the Lower East Side in New York City, and he said, I quote, "This neighborhood, peopled almost entirely by the people who claim to have been driven from Poland and Russia, is the eyesore of New York, and perhaps the filthiest place on the Western continent. It is impossible for a Christian to live there, because he will be driven out, either by blows or this dirt and stench. Cleanliness is an unknown quantity to these people. They cannot be lifted up to a higher plane because they do not want to be. If the cholera should ever get among these people, they would scatter its germs as a sour does grain." It's like, wow, this is kind of shocking rhetoric to say this of people of Jewish descent. But then fast forward after World War II, where you have a stronger economy, and you have increased access to educational opportunities, specifically college, expansion of colleges. Now you actually see people of Jewish descent moving up the economic ladder, and they're integrated into better integrated into society. And I stress these opportunities were, of course, not afforded to African Americans. And now we're at a point where it's common to think of people of Jewish descent as white, as in that social construct. So again, this goes to show that we can grow up and conditioned to kind of view these things as with a sense of permanence, but things change as they suit. And then I want to talk about racism briefly. Again, anytime someone says the word racism, you can kind of see in their brain, you can see the emotional trigger, getting wheeled in there. And I think the key thing to stress here is that remembering that first, you look at race as the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that then those differences produce inherent superiority of a particular race. And one of the things I like about this definition of racial prejudice plus power is you're intersecting this belief with actually then, intentionally exploiting other, vulnerable populations. And this is an example where I think about Amy Cooper. So Amy Cooper, a couple of weeks ago, there's a story of a white woman who was walking in Central Park, and then she was walking with her dog who was unleashed. There was not on the leash, I'm sorry, and there was an African American who was just sitting on the bench bird watching, and African American male, and he saw that the dog was not unleashed, and he asked Miss Cooper to please put the dog back on a leash. She was insulted, and there was a little bit of an argument. And the next thing you know, she's like, "I'm going to call the police." And she first exhibited prejudice because she's like, "Oh, I'm going to call the police and tell them that you are threatening me." So there's prejudice in terms of a preconceived notion that's often negative, and said, and what's the preconceived notion? That African American Black men are inherently dangerous. They're inherently threatening, right? And then she then used her power to then on the phone, even though she was 10 feet away from from the man who was just videotaping what was going on. She's saying, "Oh, I'm being threatened. My life is in danger, yada, 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 yada." And so she's using this to, put this man in a vulnerable situation. There are countless examples of Black men who've been brutalized by police. So that's not an innocuous thing. And I was just shuddering kind of watching that. And then in the video, and then after all this came out, And, she was kind of facing the repercussions. She was like, I want to state that I'm not racist, but she meets the definition right there. So I think, again, it's important to always think about definitions and to try to be precise with language, because it just reflects an understanding of the situation. So other definitions, I'm not really going to do too much. There's bias and prejudice. We already talked about prejudice. Privilege is another word that brings about a sense of some emotional triggering. And again, I want to stress that this is unearned social power, unearned advantages, entitlements, and benefits. It's invisible to those who possess it. So when someone says, especially in these kind of times, like, you're privileged, countless times I've seen, white people bristle at that term, but it's invisible to you. If I'm oppressed, we've seen it. We've seen it in play. So we think about this every day. So at the same time, it can be hard to stomach, because we are indoctrinated with this mindset that if you just work hard, you'll get what you deserve. But those who are oppressed know that that's just couldn't be farther from the truth. So I wanted to talk now about the history. And again, because I'm a Black doctor practicing in West Philadelphia, and as I said before, the patients that I see, it's, one of the beauties of being in internal medicine is you're taking care of adults across a wide spectrum. And it's just really important kind of to know your history so that you can actually connect with your patient, because a key part of doctor-patient relationship is connecting. And so here in 1964, let's kind of put ourselves in that time frame. This is a year after the MLK "I Have a Dream" speech, but yet in North Philadelphia, we're not seeing that actually being actualized at all. What's instead happening is at that time, the Philadelphia government had tried to do some urban renewal in that area. What that means is essentially getting rid of these dilapidated neighborhoods, trying to recruit investment. Where have we heard this before? And instead it failed miserably. So what happens? You have people who are displaced, you have housing products that go up, people in a worse living condition. And then there was also the tension, the high amount of tension between civilians and police. The Philadelphia Tribune, with a Black newspaper at that time, had published reports of police brutality and the white police officers that got off scot-free. Where have we heard this before? This is 1964, and yet, so there was a tension that was building. So then in August 1964, a woman by the name of Odessa Bradford was driving her car with her boyfriend. They had gotten into an argument, and we're actually in the middle of an intersection while they were driving it, and they stopped the car while arguing, so it halted traffic. The two police officers came and confronted them, and the conflict escalated, and they dragged Miss Bradford out of the car to arrest her. The community saw what was going on, immediately surrounded them. Tensions escalated further into the physical confrontation. Interestingly, what ended up happening was there was a rumor that was then spread that a pregnant Black woman was beaten to death by a white police officer. You don't know if that's actually true, but then again, think about the context, right? So I just said that there's all these tensions that are building, and it just takes one thing to spark the fire, and that fire ensued. 3 days of civil unrest. You had so no one died, but there was over 700 arrests, and there was quite a bit of property damage. I think there was like 225 stores that were damaged at the time. So it's a really traumatic event, and many people remember this. And again, a 70-year-old would be able to place themselves in that time. And the next example I want to talk about before moving forward is the May 1985 bombing of the MOVE headquarters. The MOVE organization was a Black liberations group similar to the Black Panthers. The only difference is that they live in a communal setting, and they also were really invested in animal rights in addition to Black revolutionary ideology, which is kind of interesting. They were founded in 1972 in part by a social worker who was at University of Pennsylvania. So up until that time, there have been tensions between the neighborhood and because they live in a row home in West Philadelphia. And around that time, the police, the Philadelphia government had labeled the MOVE organization as a terrorist organization. And so they decided to evict and arrest the people involved and move. And after a tense standoff in which over 10,000 rounds of ammunition was fired into that house with kids in there, the police commissioner instructed the officers to drop a bomb over that house. And if you ever know, and some of you may not know what a row home is. Row home, a key aspect is that you share a common wall with the other house. So think about your house and kind of split it in half. So all these houses are connected. So what happens if you drop a bomb? It's going to affect multiple homes. So indeed, 11 people died, including 5 children. 61 homes were destroyed. And importantly, 250 Philadelphians, most of which were not affiliated with MOVE at all, were left homeless. And so again, I was born in 1987. So many people, again, will remember this event, even though it's not widely talked about. That's another point of conversation as to why we don't learn this history. So this just goes to show that the importance of, as I'm getting to know my patient, my 40-year-old patient, and as I'm getting to know my 70-year-old patient, understanding history is really critical in taking better care of a patient. When a 70-year-old patient comes in with high blood pressure, the answer is not necessarily, I'm just going to give them a pill and send them out the door. That hypertension could be contributed to a variety of stressors in their life, and so it's really important to think about. So in this setting, when you have your patients coming in, thinking about embedding this as part of your history, embedding in your history taking to really get a sense of what's going on. And I want to stress to people on the call that are not healthcare providers, the same applies to whatever business or organization that you're in. Thinking about not just looking at your customers or clients as like a transactional relationship, but asking yourself kind of like, how do I connect with them and make sure that and understand what they're going through? I mean, the capitalist approach would say, just focus on a transaction. But what we're trying to talk about today is something deeper and building deeper connections. So at this point, I wanted to talk about, get back to a little bit to the protests and think about kind of racial violence and police brutality. And there was a really great video from Professor Mark Lamont Hill that, again, tries to give us a 10,000 foot view on thinking about what's going on and trying to get us not to focus as much on just our own emotions with regards to seeing maybe property damage, but to ask ourselves the harder question, which is, why is this stuff happening? 1 second here. Still getting better at using Zoom. Let's see if this works correctly. All right, everyone see it? Okay.
So we rebel so you can feel our pain. We rebel so you can understand that enough is enough. We tried sitting in. We tried chanting. We tried singing. We tried rapping. We tried hashtags. We ran marathons so you'd listen to us. And you don't listen until you feel some of this pain. On Monday, May 25th, George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police. He was unarmed and he wasn't resisting arrest. Ever since that moment, the city has been up in arms. There have been protests that have gotten more and more intense over the days. The most recent protests have been so intense that a Target caught on fire, that things were destroyed, and the media and citizens are saying, why are these people rioting? Well, I'm going to tell you why. First of all, these are not riots. Riots are irrational, they're random, they're just brutal acts of violence with no rhyme or reason, with no purpose. These are rebellions. Rebellions are organized acts of resistance against an unjust system. What's happening in Minneapolis is no different than what happened in Detroit in 1967, what happened in LA in 1992, what happened in Ferguson in 2014. What's happening is people who have finally said, we have had enough and we are going to do something about it. People say, well, why now? Because we're tired. Black death happens every day. If Black folk rebelled every time something happened that should not happen, we'd be rebelling all day. But we don't do that. But there comes a point where you've had enough. And right now we're at a moment where we can't turn on the television, we can't go to social media without seeing somebody who looks like us put down like a dog, killed by the state, killed by random white citizens, just because we're committing the crime of being Black and outside. We're tired of it. We're tired of being one phone call away from a disgruntled white woman with an unleashed dog from being sent to a lynching. We're tired. We're tired. And the problem is, y'all don't listen until we do something. Martin Luther King said, the riot is the language of the unheard. Well, these rebellions are the language of the unheard. This system does not listen to Black death. Black death is ordinary. Black death is common. No other race is on the news or on social media getting killed day after day after day without any warning. Only Black folk. So the reason why we have to do this is to get the nation's attention. And how do you get the nation's attention? By damaging their property and by making them feel as unsafe as we feel every single day. Now, that's not to say we should go around killing people. That's not to say we should just burn stuff up just to burn it down. But every once in a while, we have to make our voices heard. We have to make our pain known. And sometimes that means stopping a cog in the wheel of capitalism. Sometimes that means shutting down a Target. Sometimes that means stopping the status quo. When people say, oh my God, they're looting, they're stealing. That's the same outrage we feel by exploitative business. That's the same outrage we feel when a government is willing to open up the country as soon as they realize there's only Black folk dying. The same unsafety and vulnerability that y'all are feeling right now, we feel every day. So we rebel so you can feel our pain. We rebel so you can understand that enough is enough. We tried sitting in. We tried chanting. We tried singing. We tried rapping. We tried hashtags. We ran marathons so you listen to us. And you don't listen until you feel some of this pain. People are saying, well, you're destroying your own neighborhood. Look how irrational these people are. Again, stop framing Black people as irrational. We're not destroying our own neighborhoods. That Target might be in the hood, but we don't own it. Those businesses might be in our neighborhoods, but we don't have a financial stake in them. The truth is, our neighborhoods have been occupied and colonized since we've been here. So when we are pushing back and burning stuff down, and when we are destroying things, it's not because we don't have a plan. It's because y'all haven't listened to plan A or plan B or plan C or plan D. So by the time we get to this stage, this is all we have left. So if you want there not to be rebellions, if you don't want to see these cities on fire, then listen to us when we tell you we're in pain. Listen to us when we tell you we're vulnerable. Listen to us when we tell you we're unsafe. Listen to us when we tell you, America, you got to do something different, because if you don't, everybody's going to experience what it's like to be in America.
All right. Everyone there?
Yeah.
So now I wanted to move to the part of the presentation where it's more reflective. Last Monday, we had residents submit reflections on kind of how they're processing this, everything that's been going on. And each person on the Zoom chat have been assigned, or specific people have been assigned to kind of read a particular passage. So let's just go ahead and get going.
Okay, and so the first slide is slide number 12, and that's going to be read by Ocean.
All right, so this is a resident from UPenn, I believe, Iboro, talking about in response to what's going on. I hate using the F word, but that's the only word that keeps coming to mind. This is just fucked up, fucking wrong, inexcusable, enraging, disgusting, despicable. Yeah, sorry. Wait, can we?
Yeah, we just have to back it up. There we go. Thank you.
It's just so fucking frustrating that there's no change despite so many unnecessary, brutal deaths. It's hard to reconcile why these deaths occurred to myself, because it just makes no fucking sense. I am so angry about this. I don't think hurt has entered yet, because it's just blind rage right now. I am so sorry that this has happened, is happening. It just seems like lynching to me, and we get so angry and appalled about that, but somehow this isn't universally angering in the same way. I can't understand it. It seems like there's no end in sight, just the Black community bleeding with no one there to stop it. I've made some calls and signed the petitions, and I'm trying to start the hard conversations with people who aren't angry, but I don't know how else to help. I hope everyone in our program feels supported and loved and knows that we are here for all residents. The minority residents in our program, we love you, we are here for you. I'm so sorry for this and know we can never fully feel your pain, but we will be here alongside you in every way we can. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Ocean. And then the next slide is slide number 13. And I believe that one is for Chris to read, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Sure. It is only in the last few years that I have noticed that I have become more afraid of cops. I am sure it is due to the video after video of unarmed Black men being assaulted, shot, and often killed by people in uniforms. I was fortunate, if not sheltered, to have avoided those experiences in my childhood, adolescent, and early 20s. Outside of being asked to speak for my race as often the only representative in a room, I have faced very little overt racism. I think my fear is probably overblown. My dress, my speech, and of course my badge make it unlikely I will have any unwanted encounters or experiences. But I have become more aware when cops are around. I walk a little slower. I keep my hands visible. If I am nervous as an upper class citizen, one of the most respected careers in our society, what must the rest of the community feel?
Okay, and then I'm going to be reading the next slide, number 14. I'm sitting down at my computer trying to read up on patients, but I can't focus. All I can think of is Ahmaud Arbery, the way that he was hunted like prey. He was doing an activity that I love to do, running. It was yet another assault on the Black body at the most basic level. I take a second and turn around to see my other colleagues poring over patient records. As part of me screams inside, can you not see me? Can you not see my pain? Do I not matter to you? Or do I matter to you? It has been a week since Arbery's murder hit the national headlines, yet I haven't heard a single word of support from my colleagues at Penn or the administration. We are all hands on deck trying to treat patients with COVID, but still, what's the threshold to get a response from people? 2 murders? 5? I've been reminded in re-experiencing this trauma, I am more than a doctor. My Blackness needs healing too. To be reminded that irrespective of my talents as a doctor, this assault on my identity is not okay. Fast forward to May 31st, the morning after a night of escalation and protests, reading and watching far-right extremists instigate violence, damage property, in the midst of nonviolent Black Lives Matter protests breaks my heart. Watching white policemen who are supposed to protect us sneakily flash white supremacy signs to the camera shows how far we have to go. For us Black folk, this is our life battle. We are barely holding on. White people, it's time to tap in and join the fight. Shoulder our pain, our fear, our rejection, and anger. Show us what it means to be an ally. It requires a lifelong journey in humility, in increasing awareness, in challenging yourself to move outside your comfort zone. Facebook protests simply aren't good enough. The question is, are you really ready to work? And then the next slide is going to be read by Gertie.
The broader societal processes are a much longer conversation, but one of the things I'm currently bracing myself for is people in medicine trying to chart a course through this that remains neutral. While I understand the allure of social neutrality and why people in medicine often feel the obligation to remain apolitical, with every year that goes by, I become less patient with people buying into this fantasy. To be clear, neutrality is impossible here. Not just that, there is a moral imperative to not be neutral, but even absent, that it is simply not possible. To remain inactive in a society that routinely and systemically harms its members is to acquiesce to complicity. And I am waiting with a little bit of bated breath to see how far some of my colleagues are ready to take things this time around. My fear is that much of the conversation is going to be limited from the get-go, with anxieties over us not overstepping our bounds, staying in our lane, not alienating people with the actions that we desperately need to take. I'm hopeful that I will be wrong about this, that on Monday there will be a lively conversation oriented in the direction of direct action, of not just condoning our places of work as safe spaces, but of really critically engaging with our obligations to extend beyond them and play instrumental roles in leading our societies. We occupy an exceptionally unique time right now, where the entire field of medicine is both highly visible and highly regarded. What do we do with that opportunity is now up to us.
Thank you, Gertie, for reading that. I know that we're going to segue into questions. Ivy, I didn't want to interrupt. If you'd want to say a few more components. I know I've started to put in the chat some of the information for the next, questions, but the purpose is to have a conversation that's organic, one that's fluid. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to say.
It's a very powerful set of slides to read, and I can say, just on a personal level, I know reading them out loud, as we were, it's it really is almost hard to get the words out, to read them on the page and then to actually articulate them. I think perhaps it might be a nice place for us to start, which is just for those who are here in this chat and those broader watching this live stream. I think it would be interesting to hear what people think about what those reflections, were, and certainly more broadly about Iboro's presentation. So I don't necessarily want to call on people. I encourage you to sort of flag yourself and put that in the chat and let us know, and then we'll moderate accordingly. So the first question really is just about your own reaction to the slides and either reading it out loud or hearing them. I'm curious what people think. And then I guess we need to go through and do a brief introduction before. So Robert, I know you have something you'd like to say. Why don't you introduce yourself and then let us hear what your thoughts are.
Hi, everyone. My name is Robert. I'm a second-year medical student at Pritzker. And so it's very interesting. So this is a pretty hard time for me because I'm studying for step one. The coronavirus situation is going on. And for people that don't know, step one is like a board exam that kind of has a huge impact on residency. And then this event happened. And so for me, at least, it was very frustrating because it's just something that I've seen so much. And, I came to medical school after college, and it's something that you would think has gotten better. I've talked to like my parents and my grandparents, and they've really described stories like this happening during their time. And so it's very jarring that this is still happening. And what's even worse is that there are smaller instances like this that don't necessarily get, reported. Like my sister was racially profiled when she was 13 because her friends were white and stealing things from a store, and she wasn't. And the owner of the store targeted her specifically and asked to search her backpack, and she was crying, and she called my mom, and she just basically said, I don't know what's going on. I don't know why this is happening. And, in my school's group me, someone actually mentioned something that a little kid said, which was, when will they like us? Which, when I thought about that, I was just like, it's really bad that people are, growing up, including me, and we can't see the police as, a group of people that are safe, or we're wary of like a lot of different things. So Pritzker has been really supportive about that. We've had different talks, and we've kind of gone over a lot of things. I was able to, I took some time and allowed myself to recover. One thing that I was very unhappy with was when the medical examiner, there were two that examined his body, and as physicians, one of them said that it was due to underlying health conditions, and the other one said that it was due to anaphylaxis. And so I talked with some of my friends at the med school, and we were just basically saying, it's like something that you choose. It's just a very concerning thing that some, medical providers, regarded so highly in society, can see things like that, or say things like that, which is just awful. And then overall, I would say my friends and everyone around me has been quite supportive, but I'm also from rural Georgia. And so there have been things that I've seen or heard from some people apparently there's this thing called Black privilege, which I didn't know that was a thing. But basically people have said, oh, you know, Black people get to call people racist. Black people have their own dating sites. Black people get their own colleges. Black people get their own neighborhoods. And I was just like, this is due to a lot of systemic issues, and this isn't something that people ask for. It's not fun for me to call someone racist or identify something as being racist. And so I think it's very concerning that even in 2020, and that people express these ideas, we have a president that, you know, expresses these ideas, and it doesn't really feel safe for me and a lot of my family members and friends. And I think that that's not really okay.
Yeah, Robert, thank you for sharing that and for your impressions. I know that Charisse had mentioned something, she had a reaction to what was being discussed, and I'm gonna have her introduce herself, and we'll ask that everyone keep their responses to a somewhat, you know, small time frame so that we can get through some of these questions. Okay, Charisse, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Charisse Maynard. I'm actually a healthcare strategist. So I work with Loren academics, but I also work with everyday doctors in several different fields of study. And one thing I noticed, I would work with a lot of private practice doctors and that type of thing. And what I noticed is in the last week or two, it's been very emotionally draining because I've been contacted by a lot of them, asking them what they should do and that they want to issue a response letter to the communities and that type of thing. And I was discussing with Loren the other day, I don't feel like that's my place to tell them how to respond to something that's going on. But as their advisor, I do give them to a level of direction. But what I notice is that some of these physicians, I've been with them like 5 years, and even early on, when I would tell them stuff like, you know, you really need to diversify in this company and that type of thing if you want to be here 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and into the future, because the people you'll be taking care of and providing care for and I used to say this in 2020, 2050 and beyond. That used to actually be a speech I would give because I speak nationally about these things. I would say they're not going to look like they looked 5 years ago, and you need to be able to take care of these people. So what are you doing? So those same practices still look the same today as they did back then. They haven't done anything, changed anything. So when they were asking me that, one group practice, I said to them, I said, you haven't even managed to hire a woman, let alone any other type of minority. You don't want to change, and it's not my place to change you. You have to see, you know, what's going on in the community and who you're taking care of, and you have to want to change, but I can't make you want that change. I can craft a letter from it for you. I can do your PR and put a spin on it. But because I know your heart, I know you're just paying lip service to this issue, and that's not fair to the community. So you have to decide where your mind is and your heart is, and then react. I said, if you're authentic, you will know how to react. You won't need me to tell you. So I was just wondering, you know, how do we affect change? Because it's one thing to notice a problem. And yes, we know what's going on right now with policing, and even in medicine, I think that doesn't get talked about enough. It is wrong, but it's like getting I don't know if any of you ever read The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but I'm like, the person who's being oppressed knows that it's wrong. The oppressor doesn't have a problem with it because it's status quo. How do we get the oppressors to recognize and do something different?
Yeah, thank you, Charisse. I think you're raising a good point, and I know that's one of the questions that we have for this evening. And Chris is going to respond, I think, to the initial question that we raised about the reflections, and we're going to segue back into then the remaining questions we have so that we can address that, because you're bringing up a point I think that's on all of our minds, and I think it's vitally important that we move forward with plans and not just talk. So, Chris, please go ahead.
So when I first heard about this, I was talking with my father about it, and he had called me and he was saying how this hit him differently than all the other videos, all of the other deaths that he had seen and heard. And it was the middle of the week, and I honestly sort of put it in a box, didn't look into it more, didn't read up, didn't watch anything, but just said that right now I need to get through my week, and my emotional bandwidth won't allow me to feel and process all the feelings that are going to come along with it. And so I sort of paused that and then waited till the weekend where I had more time to watch it, to reflect, to sit with the emotions, and then sort of plan time to go on walks to reflect while I'm walking, to just give that space for thinking through it, feeling through it, and working at my own pace at getting to a point of thinking about plans, thinking about actions, thinking about what can I do for change, what can we do on a systematic level as well as an individual level for engaging in change. I think one of the realities within America is that there's a historical legacy of inconsistency between things stated and actual practices. Our Constitution says we find all men to be created equal, and that is self-evident, not needing any sort of justification. Yet there was slavery, there was a view that Black people were not human. And even within medicine, we find healthcare disparities, difference in outcomes. And in a profession where people go in wanting to help people, you're trained on how to engage, how to communicate, how to be present with your patients. We still see these differences in outcomes. And so the reflecting about this has led to thoughts on how do we communicate and what degree of change is necessary. I think the reality is there is a certain degree of change that happens when you're present and able to be in positions of influence with directing how your care is given. Within the clinical context, a lot of times the physician is the highest ranking person that gets to set the culture and the norms. And even within the position, there's typically still a hierarchy. But using your degree of influence at whatever level that is to bring about change, to communicate alternative views is something that can be helpful. And also looking at allies within the healthcare system, allies within the workforce for helping to share and expand the narrative of views that people understand and engage with. One of the ways in which that happens in the hospital can be with the use of chaplains who are able to spend time with patients, who are able to talk about their religious views, their spiritual views. And I think in moving forward, we have to think not only what can we do, who are those that we can join with, and starting, even if it's with one or two people, working with those and also giving each other the time and space to process and acknowledge the bandwidth that we do have. And it's okay to say, I don't have the bandwidth right now, but as long as you can come back to the problem, come back to the table, the dialogue, so that we can continue to have forward progress.
Yeah, that makes sense, Chris. Thank you. I know we have a few people I do want to just acknowledge and welcome because we didn't do formal introductions at the beginning. And so I'm sort of having people introduce themselves as they, as they talk. And so I do want to I want to segue over to Iboro and have him respond to a question that was put into the larger chat. But before I do, I just want to ask for Lida and Ryan, if you could just each introduce yourselves, just briefly your name and schools and so forth, just so that we make sure we're being mindful of that. So Lida, if you could go ahead, and then Ryan, thank you.
Sure, my name is Lida James. I go to UIC, University of Illinois, College of Medicine, and am a second transitioning into third year medical student. I'm also a nurse at U of C, where some of you guys have gone and are going. So yeah, there's a lot that I've written down, and I'm gonna try my best to kind of, I don't want to hold back, but at the same time, I don't want to like dominate the conversation. So that's me.
Thank you, Lida. And if you want, you can also put some of the thoughts and questions into the group chat. You can do that privately or to everyone if you'd like. You certainly don't have to. And Ryan, if you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I was late today. I'm Ryan Battles. I'm a fourth year medical student at Northwestern. It's first week back after the start of COVID, so this week's been very chaotic for me, but it's good to see you all.
Thank you for being here, both of you. Iboro, if you could give some thought to the question that was raised from the YouTube chat, and it's from Rebecca, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Anastoswallen. And she said she'd like to hear some thoughts about how to push for institutional change on top of self-reflection and personal change. Like, divestment from police, fair employment practices, and other things. So I'd like to start with Iboro on that question and then open that up more broadly, if we could.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I think what it takes is again, multiple people at different capacities pushing for change. I think that there has to be more of a critical mass. Like I remember as a medical student, one of my closest mentors, Dr. Bill McDade, who's now the head of diversity initiative for the ACGME, which is basically our accrediting institution for residency programs across the country. He's also African American and also an MD PhD. He kind of took me under his wing, and I had an opportunity to watch him progress to becoming provost or deputy provost at the University of Chicago and taking on a variety of roles. And I think one of the challenges just from talking to him is kind of how you kind of oftentimes feel you're at a ceiling a little bit in trying to break through and push for change alone. And so I think kind of, and I'll talk about this when I talk about my final kind of summing up action slide. I think the only way to really kind of push this forward is we need to have multiple stakeholders involved in the conversation to be able to really push for change. And I think Rebecca makes a good point about looking at different aspects of things. So for example, what is a relationship of the university to a variety of organizations, whether it's relationship to the Philadelphia police, whether it's relationship to other businesses, because what does that say? Because as a society, it's a community that influences how we perceive that institution, right? What is happening at the level of the chair of medicine or at the level of, thinking more broadly across campus? Are we in those rooms to be able to kind of push for change? And I think a big thing that we have realized at Penn is that, number one, with our deep connections we have among each other, we have power, but also I think there's a big thing about recognizing the power that you have. I think as residents, we realize at Penn that we are, there's so many different parts of the healthcare community at Penn that makes it work, but us as residents are critical cog in making it work. Like imagine residents walked out for one day, it would be pandemonium. And I think that there's something to be said for understanding that power and being able to push back and saying, we have a critical part to play in how we're in the vision of what this medical institution looks like. And we want to see to the table to make sure that it's reflecting the culture that we want to build. And so I think it requires, in a sense, of movement, and it's not just going to be one person. And that's why what my hope is now where people are starting to wake up and are able to utilize their talents and their positions where they are to be able to put pressure from a variety of perspectives, because it's not just going to be one person alone. It really has to be a movement, a grassroots movement from the bottom up to make change, to put pressure, because people in power are comfortable. People in power are acting like they don't want to lose power. That's just natural. So instead, if we want to change things, we really have to come together across coalitions. The last thing I'll say, in history, there's a time and time again, you will see that anytime people of lower class, or whether it's especially economic, are trying to build community or coalition, those of higher class do whatever they can to break it apart. Why? Because there's so much power when it comes to coming together. And I think the same thing applies in any organization. So it's really critical to think about that, because it can't just be one figurehead that makes change.
Yeah, Iboro, thank you for that. And I think that, I sort of weave this in as I segue over to something that Adlita wrote and in connection to this. But I think one of the things that, Iboro, you and I had talked about recently is, sort of that idea of community and connection, and thinking about, I had mentioned the importance of mental health. I said, I think there's really going to be a call to arms almost. I know, Chris, we talked about that a little bit too. And I'm mindful about the use of language here, but I do think that at a certain point, part of why we started these discussions and why we started looking at ways in which we could make changes was because I was deeply concerned about everything I was hearing from my residents, from my students, who were very much on the front line. And then on top of everything else, all of the chaos with, multiple murders, deaths, etc. And all of a sudden, it was like a cataclysmic event. It was now no longer just about mental health or no longer just about racism. It was everything. And so I want to segue over, if I can, to Edlita. She wrote something in the chat. Edlita, do you want to read that, or would you like me to, or do you want to just simply speak from it?
I'll read it. It's fine. I just wrote that this country has not attempted to do the hard work of racial reconciliation on a national level, where intentional conversation and healing is involved in public spaces, not private, not dinner tables. So much inequality, terror, all these people who passed away recently, lives have been taken over centuries, not even just these past days, weeks, months, but we're talking about 400 years. And I just know that in high school, like especially now as history, books get larger and larger with the volumes of history they're trying to write. People are not learning the depths of slavery and the impact that it has had. And even, coming from another country and learning about US history, if you're in that other country, and I'm thinking specifically about my husband who's from Cameroon, he had no idea slavery. I mean, it was a very glossed over kind of topic. There was slavery and you don't know what that means and looks like until you're here. And, here we are in Chicago, where you can see the history of slavery and the segregation of neighborhoods and the inequality. And so I feel like that's something that very much we need. And I wrote that because just reading Trevor Noah, he coming from South Africa, he himself writing in his book how South Africa really tried to make a point of having the public dialogues. People are crying, they're angry, people are learning about what, apartheid has done to families and generations, and people openly apologizing and crying from that, and having just some type of reconciliation, because it's so heavy. It's almost like the elephant in the room that no one talks about in this country. We don't talk about how slavery has built the economy of the history in the US and how that propels forward and helps, some and not all, or not equally. And so I think another thing I always think about, and it's something that was slightly talked about earlier, is the question is, when you are privileged, when you've created a world or society that benefits you, and however what way that is, and here it's mostly racial, what makes you want to give that up? Or what makes you want to make others elevate? Or like what as a human being makes someone want to forego their privilege or help someone get to their level? I'm just curious, and that's just an open question, because it's something I always think about when I try to understand privilege in this country, as well as other countries. In other countries, there are a lot of very similar things with ethnic groups, and one ethnic group may dominate. What makes us want to give up privilege when we are the privilege, in whatever context that is? So it's just a question, because I'm curious.
It's an excellent question, Adlita, and I'm sort of on a rush to jump in and answer it, but I want to make sure I don't usurp anybody on this call. So first, to the group, do you have responses that you would like to share? And I will happily jump in after.
I think Ocean does.
Ocean, please go ahead and introduce yourself too. I know you do.
I'm Ocean. I am the executive coordinator at LAS. If you've needed scheduling, you've seen me or heard from me. I am also currently a therapist, and as of Sunday, a med school applicant. So I am pursuing this field. And I think, Adlita, in response to your question, what makes us want to give up the privilege, in some ways that's part of the reason why I'm interested in medicine, is I'm from Canada. It's very easy for me to take a step back and say, like, oh, I'm Canadian, like this is a problem in the country where I live, but this is not my problem, but Justin Trudeau the other day had a very interesting and funny but not funny response to his perspective on how Trump is currently handling it. He's asked, and there's about 30 seconds of silence in which you can hear cricket chirping and him clear his throat a couple of times, followed by him very carefully saying that what is happening in America is not okay and it needs to be fixed, but then B, acknowledging that Canada also has those problems. And it brought up for me, like, yes, I have the privilege to say, like, all right, my police in Canada are maybe not marching by the hundreds, but that doesn't mean that we in Canada aren't still doing that. And so in some ways it's a privilege to step back and remove myself, but it's also within that privilege, it's also the privilege for me as someone who's been removed from all of it to say, yes, this hasn't affected me as directly as it has affected some other people, but at the same time it does. And I think for me, that's what makes it really important for me to want to go into medicine, is knowing that I have the privilege to feel in some ways removed, but then I also have the privilege to know that I'm not removed, and because I have that half of a degree of separation, I can take that and get power from that and use that to uplift the voices of other people who look like me, who are like me, who look different, but are coming from that same background of being discriminated against, and say, all right, well, I have the privilege to feel comfortable speaking, even though in some ways I am in danger, and I'm going to use my comfort and the way that I look and the way that I am to express how we can make that change and to put myself in a position to be visible when other people don't feel comfortable doing so.
Yeah, Ocean, thank you. I think these are excellent points, and it's almost overwhelming to know which way to pivot and where to go. I know Chris is going to make a comment. Before I shift over that way, there's 2 or 3 things I want to say. One is, it's just about 7 minutes after the hour. We were assigned to end at 1:15. I've asked if we could go till 7:30. Central time. That would be 8:30 East Coast time and 6:30 Mountain time. If that would be okay with the participants, I don't want to make an assumption. So can I just get a thumbs up or a thumbs down? And if you have to leave, obviously I understand. Thank you. Good. It looks like we have the thumbs up and clearance. 2, I think there's an interesting point to be made, Edlita, to your question, I think, regarding why would anybody want to give up privilege? And, it may sound overly simple to say simply because it's absolutely undeserved to have privilege that you did nothing to deserve getting it for in the first place. So why should you want to take a stand to hold on to something that you really simply got by virtue of what, being born with white skin? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. So to me, and the question wasn't entirely directed at me, but I would say, I think that if you think about it in another context, like when we get older and we look a certain way, we could say, oh, hey, I feel pretty good. I look kind of younger. I feel nice or whatever, etc. But all of a sudden you get older and you get wrinkles and you get gray hair and so forth. And that's part of DNA. It's just part of what happens, right? It's part of life. You don't do anything to deserve or earn the wrinkles or the gray hair any more than you do anything to earn or deserve white skin. So to me, it's a roll of the dice. And I think your question is really an important one. It seems astounding to me. It would be something anyone could be deeply invested in holding on to if it's something that they did nothing to deserve. So I'm going to segue over to Chris, but I just, from a position of somebody who is white, and to me, I would be outraged to feel any differently than that. Embarrassed and outraged. Chris.
So I think that, one, my personal belief is that no one should feel guilty about their privilege. They should just be responsible in the use of their privilege. I think a lot of times framing it from a deficit standpoint comes from a mentality of oppression, specifically looking at a me versus you exploitation pattern. Because while you could look at me losing privilege, the reality is the distribution of privilege to others elevates our society and how we engage, how we communicate, and demonstrates us being able to actually be more productive and move forward as a community better. And so why do people not share or have opposition to sharing privilege and losing that? Is because it loses value, it loses the advantages that they have in life that they want to use to better themselves, their children, their children's children. At our program, we do a series on social justice every year, and we had a speaker come in who was talking about going up to a suburb in the northern part of Chicago to ask for white women to give money to help fund standardized test prep programs for underserved and specifically Black kids in downtown Chicago. And one of the mothers stood up and said, why would I give something that's going to make it hard for my son to succeed? That if I help them succeed and do better, then what if my son now doesn't have the best scores? What if the scores now seem average versus above average? So there is a self-interest, self-preservation, desire for betterment of ourselves that everyone has on a very human level. And yet, while acknowledging that, we have to also acknowledge and think about our community and how about we go about trying to better our lives. Because there are limited resources, there are limited supplies and things. And while we are all working to gain more privilege as a Black male physician, my life, my experience, the things that I see, say, and also the people that I just know and am connected with is a lot different than other people who may be Black, but not in the same social circles and have less access to the same resources or capital of making that phone call to get in or making a phone call to make something go away. And so why do we see this? It's because it comes from a view of oppression, of trying to take from others to keep for ourselves. And that doesn't have to be the view for privilege, for community development, because I think if we can change and realize that I am my best self when my neighbor is their best self and we can work together, then we can see the fear and the desire and the rationality for preservation and ostracization and oppression of others be removed and see actually it's in the benefit of the entire community for us all to do well. It's in the benefit of the entire community for everyone to have well-paying jobs. It's in the benefit of the entire community to be able to have a safe place for their kids to go, to have them become educated, then develop the future scientists, the future doctors that are going to come up with new discoveries, new medicine, new breakthroughs as we advance our society. And so I think it's just a mentality change from colonization and oppression to growth that we have to make as a society and as an individual.
Chris, thank you. I think these are excellent points, and I appreciate what you're saying. I think that, you know, it brings us back into sort of this question about, you know, what are the next steps going to look like, or what are we going to do in an actionable way? How do we take responsibility? One of the questions that came to us again is about sort of what would doctors do, you know, to communicate safety with non-white patients, given the history of mistrust that we have with medical institutions and so forth. And this is a question that's being raised about, you know, if there's not trust in access to the healthcare, if there is not trust in the provision of healthcare and so forth, what's going to happen to communicate effectively? How are we going to go about the business of making sure that patients are cared for, non-white, etc.? And I think we need to look a little at, you know, policy. We need to look a little bit at, you know, practices and so forth. And I think it brings in questions about, you know, about how we address racism, but how we also address the barriers to the access to healthcare in the first place. So I'd like to put that question out there as it's coming from the live stream chat as well. And so I want to make sure that we answer that. I'm also going to reserve a space in here that we get to some of the spheres of influence as well. So if we could answer this question, I'm curious, those of you sitting in this chat, if you have some thoughts specifically about that. I've overwhelmed everybody in this room.
I think the key thing, and I think this is a really good question. I think a key thing is being clear. Like, I think people underestimate that. Like, giving people the respect that they deserve in terms of, this is why we're thinking about this treatment. This is kind of what the risks and the benefits are. And I think you're seeing that more in medicine, but being more aware of that, especially when you're dealing, talking or taking care of patients, who come from minority groups who have been historically, mistreated by medical institutions. And I think it's also really important to think about, look, a lot of academic institutions are in, like, University of Chicago, Penn, we're in, lower income neighborhoods. And what's our relationship with that? We have a responsibility to really be there for our patients, and make sure that we're being there for those patients, and not just, taking care of super, complex diseases and so forth. And so I think that there's there's the kind of the outpatient aspect of kind of being, when you forge that relationship with patients, really focusing on indicating you're going to be their advocate, being really clear, and just really focusing on communication. And I think this also is important also, and I say this as a resident on an inpatient perspective. Patients have chronic medical conditions and they're coming into the hospital, and we can see that you work hard, think you're tired, and you're kind of more susceptible to implicit bias. And it's important to, especially in patients that I'm taking care of who are African American or from another minority group, trying my best to advocate for them, especially when I feel like another colleague could be a little bit kinder, could be, can maybe get that medication over a little bit sooner, and just trying to make space for that. And I think it's oftentimes the little things that really go a long way in creating that atmosphere of trust.
I think that's absolutely right. It's was Robert, were you raising your hand, or were you, yeah?
Oh yeah, I was gonna say something when you were done.
No, go
really
ahead.
Quickly.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, as a med student, I haven't had that much exposure, but I will say one thing that's nice about what we have at UChicago is there is a very strong emphasis on having different cultural backgrounds, people of color, just a very diverse class in general. And we have a very good healthcare disparities class, which I think really helps since we're on the south side of Chicago. And I guess one thing that might be minor is just, if possible, trying to spend more time with patients. I know seeing my dad, I've gone to doctor's appointments, and I'm there, and they don't really know I guess they don't know that I can understand what they're talking about. And they've talked to him really fast. They've said very negative things to him, or very condescending things. And then I always chime in and say something, and then they kind of change, like, oh, sorry. And so I think not only should, providers try to spend more time with their patients, but they should really focus on their issues, not so much, and, brushing things off, as opposed to, trying to go from room to room, which I know is hard, but it is something that I think is important.
Thank you, Robert. It makes sense. I think what I'd like to do is, if I can, is be mindful of time here, is to segue into your last slide. I know that one of and I apologize because I know there's many questions that we have, and I just want to be sensitive to, I think, the actionable component of this. And so the question is, what do we do? And I know, Edlita, you've got something you'd like to say real fast, and Sheree says put something in there too. So go ahead, Edlita, and then we'll segue into the slide. We can pull that up maybe into the chat.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I think people downplay representation, especially when it's coming from like a majority group. If you hear someone who's a non-majority saying, like, we need more representation, whether that's gender, racial, whatever, I think that's super important and vital, because it helps check people at the level. So if these are physicians in a room with other physicians and there's more representation that looks like the patient population, then you're able to kind of check people because there's numbers behind you. I would say that a big field that gets overlooked when it comes to healthcare outcomes is nursing, because you're at the bedside. And so what I see and what makes me upset at University of Chicago is that there's nurses who may not look like the patient in the room. And because of preconceived notions, well, I know there's these PRN pain medications, but they are just lying. She says she's sick, and it's a big deal because you are the one at the bedside for 12 hours straight. And people overlook that. They say, oh, it's doctors. Like, no, my friend, like it's the people who are coming in saying, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Oh, I see you're tachycardic, but maybe you're just anxious. And there's just, I get so upset sometimes because the standards of care change based on if we're in the Mitchell building versus CCD, the different parts of the hospital. But it's a lot of the nurses coming in, their perception of the person in front of them will very much play into their care. It's not just what the residents are deciding. And that's what scares me. I've actually asked them if they could please do research on that, because outcomes are different based on the nurse who's taking care of you. And a lot of it is based on your experiences with patients that look like the age group, the race, fill in the blank, the medical diagnosis, and how you take care of them, really. And it scares me that gets overlooked, because I'm like, no, it's a lot of the nursing too. But I just wanted to say that we overlook those at the bedside. It's not just nurses, but it could be the nurse's aide. It could be the respiratory therapist, whatever perception, the social worker coming in talking, the chaplain, everyone.
Big support for social workers, so yeah.
I had to say that. But it's true. But it is true. Those who walk in and take care of, or are supposed to take care of you. I would also say, I think we need to do a job of respectfully checking people. As Robert had noticed, people are talking and they're using lingo and they're assuming you don't get it. And I would say for those of us who may not look like the majority taking care of your parents or of yourself, we have to respectfully check people. I hear you, I understand it. Can you slow down? And I even hear patients telling me that, yeah, the doctor came in and was just talking and talking. And we were like, whoa, slow down. Or we get what you're saying. We're not stupid. So it is, I think part of that is us having to check people respectfully. But that's what I wanted to say.
Absolutely. I think one of the phrases we use a lot in our office even is just simply push pause. You just have to push pause to listen, to really hear where somebody is, because if we don't do that, you end up talking right through someone. You miss a lot. So absolutely. I would like to stay in this call for another few hours. I think we have big mountains to move, but I'm going to be mindful about the slide, and I'm going to say to Iboro, if you'd like to maybe pull that up and put that on the screen, we can take a look at sort of where things are with that. This comes after the reflection slides, and this is taking a look now actionably. So take it away, Iboro.
First off, this has been a really great conversation, and it's just really been really insightful to talk about all these issues. So what I talked about on Monday and I'm talking about today is as we think about action, kind of similar to kind of thinking about moving from a bottom-up approach, it comes down to connection. It comes down to, for me as a leader, the key part of leadership is how we connect with others. And that is super key to how we build community. And it's a super important way of how we build the culture that we want to build. And so this is not, there's going to continue to be unrest. And I think in the midst of this, trying to break it down in terms of how we connect with each other is important. So thinking about how we connect with society, each other, and so forth is critical. So I think the first thing, connecting with society, it sounds basic, but I think it's important to keep up to date on national events. Of course, my bias as a doctor and a scientist is please utilize impartial sources if possible. But nonetheless, it's just important to kind of have an idea what's going on. When I first sent the text to my colleagues, and I talked to a colleague later, she admitted that she actually didn't even know until I said anything that about the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of Breonna Taylor, the murder of George Floyd. This is someone who's like a really good friend of mine. I just looked at her like, are you kidding me? Like, I had to check her. I had to be like, we have to do better. And she recognized that. And in getting more context, she said, well, in the midst of COVID, I've just been wanting to kind of get away from news media. And I thought that was really interesting because in my mind, I'm like, I can't escape news of racial violence. I can't escape news of police brutality. It affects everything I do, how I think about the world every day, right? And one of my other friends had made an interesting comment that a way to kind of think about what it's like to be a minority with regards to racial violence, police brutality is to think about what it's like living in the midst of COVID, right? You could turn off the news, but you're still seeing people wearing masks. You can't go to your favorite restaurant. You can't see your loved ones. You're at an emotional low point because you're not able to do things you typically like to do. And you can't escape from that. And that's what it's like to be a Black person in this country with regards to racial violence. I mean, I remember when at Chicago, I was walking to get a running kind of marker or whatever for the half marathon. And I mean, I didn't have on baggy jeans. I had on a shirt, nice jeans, it's a Saturday morning. And the next thing I know, I see a cop roll up and he's like, what are you doing here? What are you doing in Old Town? What are you doing in this neighborhood? And I remember just shaking, like, I don't know what to do. Like, I was just like, what am I going to do? And it wasn't my driver's license that saved me. It was my University of Chicago ID that saved me. And they were like, oh, wow, you went to Chicago. Well, great to see you. And they just kind of went on by. Can you imagine if I didn't have that kind of badge of credibility? I think about my wife, who is also a doctor, and she's working night shifts. And currently we have a curfew in place. What happens if she comes home at 1 a.m, she's stopped on the way by a police officer? What are we going to do? Am I going to go out there and I'm even more of a threat to the police? Like, we have, and we're also parents too. So imagine a lot of your friends, your minority friends, are having these conversations, and I've heard it multiple times. My son is 13 years old. I'm already going on Facebook trying to plead with people to remind them he's not a threatening person. This affects our psyche. And so the point that I'm trying to make is you can't connect with others and be an ally for us if you don't know what's going on around you. And it's really critical to think about that. And the next thing is thinking about connecting with each other. Yes, there's a lot of, no one is expecting people to check in on Black people every second of the day. Everyone has their own friend groups. But if your friend group includes a minority colleague, you should try checking in on them. And checking in doesn't mean sending them a text, say, hope you're okay, bye. No, checking in means engaging. Checking in means willing to shoulder the burden of suffering together. It means sitting together and saying, you might not want to talk to me. You might just want to yell at me. You might just want to cry, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying because I love you and I want to build community together. And that means you're not going in with a solutions-oriented approach. One of the difficult things is that oftentimes that I've noticed is that my white friends can feel like a sense of guilt when these things happen, and they want to say a statement, they want to give money or do all these kind of things. And but you have to remember, in some way, that kind of is a little bit selfish, because it allows you to check back in and check back out, where I'm still here every day just trying to make it. And so it's important. The aspect of connecting is so critical. And I think another thing to kind of mention, and it's something we could spend hours talking about, is as you're connecting with them, just be aware of your emotions, right? Because what is bound to happen is then hurt will start talking about racism and privilege. And then next thing you know, a white person is going down this rabbit hole of saying, well, I'm not racist, or, I have Black friends, all this kind of stuff. That is, in my opinion, unfortunately, a little bit of a cop-out, in that whether or not you say you're racist or not, that actually doesn't help us build anything. It just helps you with your own guilt. That's not helping us build a movement. That's not helping us try to build a community, a culture that combats silence. And so really trying to focus I really find conversations where people try to defend their badge of honor of not being racist is honestly like a distraction for really trying to be an ally and kind of build community. The next point I want to talk about is advocacy and accountability, which is building upon connecting with each other. It's really important to hold program leadership accountable. That same friend who confessed that she didn't know about those murders, the very next day, she had sent an email to our department chair of medicine, which is one of the big wigs, and it said, you need to send a statement of support for kind of what's going on in this country, especially for minority trainees and colleagues. That email went out 5 hours later. Now, I would, as a Black man, I'm not sending that email to the department chair. Like that's especially in the amount of grief that I had. But she used her leverage, her power to enact change, and it's really important to think about that. And in your business or your organization, I think another thing to think about is thinking about the importance of diversity to create different spaces of healing. We often use diversity as kind of like this arbitrary metric where we're saying we're having this amount of Hispanics, this amount of underrepresented minorities. But I think a critical thing as a minority, kind of reflecting back, is thinking about how are we creating safe, are we creating diversity? Are we focused on diversity in order to create an enriched experience for our minorities to do well? Right now, there are people I know that are on this call, people that I've talked to who are hurting, minority trainees who are hurting. And the thing that they want the most is not actually seeing another white person. They want to see someone else who looks like them. Many people who are in higher education who are Black, know this kind of struggle where you go from middle school and high school, and the proportion of seeing people who look like you get less and less and less and less, to where you're now getting ready to go into tenure track and you are struggling to find anyone who looks like you. You're struggling to find anyone who has that can provide you that support. And sometimes you just need that space. I'm wearing my Alliance of Minority Physicians, which is a group that is of trainees, residents, faculty, and fellows across specialties at the University of Pennsylvania. That's an example of solidarity, of minority presence, where I can tap into it anytime. Where is that in your organization? Because it's not enough to say that I have this Hispanic or Black person or other underrepresented minority there. We have to think about how are we giving each other the tools to survive? Because in many ways, that group, that culture is critical for mental health, critical for wellness. And it's not enough to just say, I'm getting my numbers, but it's more about how are we creating space for healing. And lastly, I think the thing I wanted to end on is creating mental space as a program or an organization. In our program, noon conferences are critical for education, learning about new diseases, learning about basic approaches to treating diseases. And so it's really critical for us. We work really hard. And when you work really hard taking care of patients, it's hard to create space to really reflect emotionally on kind of how you're doing and kind of areas where we as a community can build. And so for us, what we're focused on now is like, how do we create curriculum like on a regular basis to combat culture of silence in a variety of contexts that may look like xenophobia. There's a lot of Asian, like one of my really good friends told me, like as a doctor, an Asian American doctor, how he's now experiencing racism for the first time in the midst of COVID because people are literally afraid of him because of COVID-19 originating in China. And so it's really important to kind of think about how, as an organization, you're creating that space for these kind of conversations to flourish. And lastly, one of the things that I want to end on is that through these connections that happened on Monday, I want to commend my program, the leadership. Everyone has come together and people are on fire. Like it literally feels like there's a movement, an awakening, and maybe it's everything happening in the midst of COVID. We're at a low emotional point. We're desperate for connection to others. I don't know, but we are, at least at Penn, we are seeing some movement. And just today, I don't know what happened to that slide. Well, anyway, today that we had our White Coats for Black Lives march, and hopefully I can, or protest, kneeling, and I hope I can find the picture before we end. But it was a really powerful, where residents, after hearing the talk, came together and were able to, they came together and worked with administration in addition to the OB-GYN faculty and residents, and we had over 2,000 people kneeling together. These are doctors, nurses, staff. We're all committed to doing the hard work, and it's going to be really hard work. But to see kind of how one conversation can lead to all this change is really powerful. And I actually, I'll try to find the pic because it was really great. I'm kind of sad that I had it on the PowerPoint. 1 second.
I have it in front of me, and I'm wondering if I can send it to you, IB, or if I can put it in the chat and it can get pulled up.
Yeah, I try to.
There it is. So it's in the chat right now, and if you want, you can pull that. You can just click on that, and it will pull up.
Okay. Let me do a new share.
Either that, or I can share my screen if need be. I'm going to let, as Iboro is doing that, I think just a couple of things to say here. I think one of the most vitally important aspects of having a meeting like this is actually the connection. And one of the things I think that I know I get asked frequently, and I know we talked about in here this evening, is just like, what do we do next, or what can we do? And Iboro has laid out a lot of different information here, and I think it's really important to give some thought to it. I think the piece that we often do is we spend time, we give, built into schedules at GME or UME, there are grand rounds. And so I'm actually making a proposal that this become a component of a grand round, so that once a month, if that's, something that gets woven in, is that there's opportunity to have conversations to focus on the culture of silence really that does exist in, in MedEd around all of these topics. I think it's vital. So looks like, Iboro, you've got the slide pulled up. I'm going to let this.
Yeah, so you can see here that it was, first of all, it was really hot outside, but a lot of people were wearing white coats, and it just, like, I was sitting kind of standing in the middle there, and just to see everyone surrounding, and of course we were socially distanced, 6 feet apart. It just was so powerful, and there's just so many people there from so many different ethnicities, and everyone was on fire, just ready to do the work. And I think the question for you all, whether you're at your own residency program or you're a different business, is the question is, are you ready to do the work? We're ready, and we're ready to kind of join in and start this movement, because let me tell you, it's not going to come from your politicians. It's not going to come from people in power. It's going to come from you. So as I like to say to my friends, it's time to lean in and do the work. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to be messy. You're going to make mistakes, but it's in those mistakes that you actually build. And that's what we're all about doing. If you're not about building, then just stay on the sideline, let someone else join in, because we really want to make change here and in our lifetime. Thank you.
Iboro, thank you so much for this. I want to thank all of our participants, Ocean, Gordy, Chris, Robert, Sharice, Ryan, and I think, do we lose somebody? And Advita. I want to make sure I said everyone. I really appreciate this. It means a lot to all of us to come together. And so thank you very, very much. And Gert, and we want to thank Fireside at 5 for helping to collaborate with us and host this as well. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I just want to echo what you said. I mean, just sitting here and getting to hear all of your experiences has really just been so valuable. I hope that everyone listening in and live streaming this was able to take what we were all able to take from this, which is just so much, like, it's actionable steps that we can be doing to actually make something change in this country. And we've got some notes that I've taken from this call that I'll type up and put in the agenda, but I just want to thank you guys all again for taking this hour and a half to really dig in. It's not easy work that you're all doing, but it's important work. And again, Fireside at 5 is here to help amplify all of your voices and make stuff happen. So we're ready, and we're ready to fight with you.
Thank you, everybody. And lots of information coming through in the chat. And so this is really awesome. And what we'll do is we'll make sure that everyone gets shared on this. And LAS is going to post this as part of the updates in our blog. And so, so thank you.
Yeah. And if you are interested, for all those people listening in, we will be continuing to do live stream series with Loren Academic Services. We're covering a variety of topics, anything from LGBTQ inclusion to diversity in medicine. So we really want to hear from all of you guys that are out there. The Fireside at 5 family is here, and we're ready to make some change happen. So let's do it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Loren.